lunch, I think that it will definitely go viral. So I would highlight that one. So
This is ensalada de papaya.
Yeah. Wow.
That's
Vanya knows what that is.
that's a weird looking papaya.
It is, isn't it?
Mama lika.
Mamalicha.
so
I am a multicultural eater.
well, based on the direction that I'm going now with a democracy project, there might be something that is at least near your refrigerator that will be useful, but I'll get to that in a moment. I alluded to it in the email that I sent to all of you recently, but the trajectory that I've been taking, I guess, has been twofold. One part of it has been working with San Jose State University on implementing some sort of basic code that would be able to instantiate democracy as an operation undertaken by random number generators instead of your average politician. So basically the concept that I described earlier, where we engineer politicians out of the system, random number generators are weighted toward a given probability of a yes or no vote on any given piece of legislation based on whether their constituents are in favor of change or the status quo. So effectively, what the baseline is what could arguably be an absurdist or a practical solution to the problems of our time, depending on your point of view, with a plug and play alternative version of democracy that doesn't require plane flight and a lot of other things that actually have become much more relevant since I started this long journey with Joel many, many years ago. This code will also be to some extent reconfigurable, which is to say that beyond just kind of doing the hand wave of saying that it's all open source and people will come and do things with it that will be more interesting than what I did, which is nothing because I don't know how to code. So instead, what the students are doing, that there will also be some affordances within it, allowing for different configurations in terms of, for instance, adding more bodies of Congress or changing the logic in some relatively straightforward ways. And so the idea is with this that it becomes what I call the future democracies laboratory. It becomes a space for experimentation on alternative configurations and alternative methodologies for collective consensus, for collective decision making. And the underlying motivation, which is ridiculously grandiose, especially given how modest the implementation is, though I believe that modest implementation allows for even more outrageous claims because you have less to hold you accountable. What I'm claiming is that we need to take the mantle of big science and we need to think about what big political science might be. And it makes sense to start that at San Jose State University, given where San Jose is, and given that big science started with Ernest Lawrence just down the block, to start big political science at San Jose State University seems compelling, or at least really provocative. So the laboratory becomes a space in which ultimately it's possible to experiment on all possible means by which a group can come to some sort of consensus, and the use of the random number generators effectively allows for rapid prototyping of possible systems given possible demographics. So it also, because one aspect of it is that the inputs can be other than they currently are, where people go to the polls every 2 years, that they can be based on other means of measurement, that this allows for other constituencies to be enfranchised. And so the other aspect of it that I've been working on has been how we might think about enfranchising children, how we might think about enfranchising animals, how we might think about plants, how we can think about this as a new way in which we understand the world in broader terms, in terms of who the stakeholders are, and we find ways in which to determine what the interests are of those stakeholders as directly as possible, and to allow for them to interact in terms of this collective decision-making process. We rethink what it means when we talk about consensus and when we talk about the collective. So ultimately, there is the high-tech possibility where what we're doing is taking, as an example, taking stress level, and a change in stress level being the basis for determining satisfaction with the status quo, and therefore a change in weighting for the black box random number generator politician in terms of a greater probability of voting for change or for stasis. So this then means that there's the possibility of exploring what that might entail, some sort of wearables in the case of humans that would be constantly monitoring, all of which, of course, is very disturbing at the same time that it is potentially provocative and maybe leads us toward some sort of reckoning with what we mean when we think about what people are doing when they make decisions. This also potentially applies to other organisms, whether it's a matter of aggregate monitoring, for instance, of sewage, or whether it's a matter of doing environmental sampling of various sorts. In the case of plants, where I've been concentrating mostly because they are 80% of the biomass, and also because it's more provocative to try to think about how to enfranchise plants and even thinking about animals, there's a possibility of looking at, instead of cortisol, looking at ethylene. And so one possibility that I told you about, I think a little bit last time, was working at the precinct level by measuring volatiles in the air in forests, for instance. And there's been some development of technologies at UC Berkeley that we could potentially use for this purpose. But the other side of it that I'm working on now, which is relatively new, that I alluded to in my email and even was starting to think about last time that we talked, is how this can become more of a grassroots initiative. How do we get people involved in this process directly? And how do we make it as simple as possible for people to do so? So last time that we talked, I had been talking about how we might use leaf stomata opening and closing as a proxy for stress level for plants, and looking at methods such as thermography as a means by which to indirectly measure that opening and closing of stomata. And it's still possible to do this. It's definitely challenging because it is so indirect. But I started to think about whether there was any way in which we could directly monitor ethylene in plants without having a laboratory and gas chromatography apparatus at our disposal, which I personally don't in my living room, and I think that that's true for most people. So ethylene is a stress hormone, but it also is involved in the ripening process. So the reason why one bad apple spoils the batch is to do with ethylene being produced by fruit during the ripening process that leads to the ripening of other fruit. So that led me to think about whether we could enlist fruit, use fruit as a sort of rudimentary probe to be able to monitor ethylene level, because it's otherwise very difficult to do so. But fruit has evolved an ability, if you want to look at it in these terms, an ability to measure ethylene. So if you were to take a pair of bananas and you were to use them as a sort of a ready-made probe, what you could do potentially would be to take a plant in from your garden and to place it under a bell jar with a banana, a green unripened banana, and another one under another bell jar next to it. And then over a period of time, expose those bananas and then observe the rate of ripening, whether very good, Roger is demonstrating as we go here. So the banana that is under the plant, or that is next to the plant, being compared to the banana that is not next to the plant, can be used as a means by which to see how much ethylene the plant is emitting. Where this becomes meaningful is to do it repeatedly over time. So is a differential in ripening, because they're both going to ripen. So is it is the differential over time? Are you showing a greater difference in terms of the ripening for the banana that's exposed to a plant that has been exposed to the environment versus one that has not been exposed to a plant at time 2 than you did at time 1? This becomes a means by which to see whether that plant is in fact satisfied with the status quo, whether it's becoming more or less stressed. So it becomes a way in which to plug into the system as a whole. So all of this is based on my literature review, which has determined both that there is reason to believe that this would work and also that there is reason to believe that nobody has ever done anything like it before. So reason to believe that it would work comes from farms that have traditionally used crushed leaves as a means by which to accelerate the ripening of bananas, just as a very practical thing. So that would indicate that there's enough ethylene produced by leaves to have an observable effect on banana ripening. However, nobody has ever thought of it as the banana being a probe to measure anything. So that's where we don't really know anything. So I've been developing an experimental protocol, the idea being that we involve a lot of people from different places to try out different variations and to see whether we can get to some stage where we determine what time is needed in terms of exposure in order to be able to get some meaningful measurement, what means might be most practical for reading your bananas. In other words, are you looking at changes in coloration, comparing that? Are you looking at changes in sweetness by eating both bananas? Are you looking at capacitance? They're actually, in my literature review, I found that capacitance is used as a measure for banana ripening in some experimental protocols. It hasn't been used widely, but it might be a more sensitive way in which to make this measurement. But it also is less accessible than eating bananas, for instance. So the motivations here are, on the one hand, can we come up with a system that would allow many people in many places to contribute, where you might imagine that ultimately an app is developed that allows you to take a photograph of your bananas before and after you've gone through a given simple process of polling the plants in your yard or in your local forest or wherever else, and that all of this is collated in a way that we're able to have local and global polling. This becomes a way in which then to have in the future maybe an enfranchisement of plants, legally speaking. And so I'm talking now through Earth Law Center about various places where that might be possible in the future. For instance, in Chile, they're now starting to rewrite the Constitution, and Earth Law Center is consulting on that process, and Rights of Nature will be a part of it. So might that be a place in which to prototype this? Who knows? Meanwhile, it becomes a way in which to inform people about the state of nature, of which of course we are all a part, but the state of their surroundings and of other species in terms of how those other species are faring within the political climate as the political climate changes, and therefore to inform people's vote and to inform people's activity, people's actions more broadly. So by getting people involved in this process at every level, from the ground up, trying to figure out how this might work, and then potentially participating in a global initiative, it becomes in its own right, I think, a way in which to get people involved in the sorts of provocation and sorts of conversation that I think are so important about what the future of democracy might be, who we should be listening to, how we should be paying attention, and how we should be, outside of just thinking about how a legislature works, how we should be aware of and sensitized to our surroundings in terms of being more, to use the cliche, more environmentally conscious in terms of the decisions that we make. So in other words, it's meant to be a lot and to do a lot. And I think that if it does any of that, I'll be very happy. But it's right now at that very early stage of my having written a protocol and trying to find people who are interested in taking it up with the ambition of getting some sort of good or stable results, some sort of meaningful results that we can then use as a basis for building some sort of simple technology in the form of an app, perhaps, that would allow for more people to participate in this and for it to become a provocation at a global level. So that's kind of where I am right now. And I'm very interested in your thoughts about it at the intellectual level, the practical level, whatever else.
Well, can I start?
Of course.
um, I just think it's such a crazy, wonderful idea, this idea of the banana differential. And it started me thinking about the connection of bananas to politics. And of course, the thing that comes to mind is the framing of the banana republic.
Right.
And I think that's quite a nice connection because, you know, banana republics are typically these politically unstable situations where often it's really primarily about the economy, and where there's a limited commodity of some form that is disruptive in that particular economy, and I think that's where the term actually comes from. You know, the idea of the bananas being that. So I think it would be really interesting to see a kind of pilot study, you know, that where you could set up, say, 3 to 5 situations, you know, in a distributed, you know, international context, as participants to sort of test out in an experiment, you know, how this could work. And it may be that there's a preliminary study as well that has to, you know, to do the basics of it to make sure that it works and all that. But just conceptually, it seems like that's a really nice connect point, you know, to find that relationship between the banana and the republic.
Yeah, I mean, obviously there is an absurdist aspect to this, and there also is a political provocation through the language. I mean, bananas are inherently funny. Banana peels are what clowns slip on, and just the word banana somehow has a humor to it. It also has that political history that really interests me. I do think that, so I thought about apples as well, for instance, and other fruit. And I think that what I'm encouraging already is let's try other fruit as well. But bananas, for all these reasons, as well as the fact that visually speaking, bananas probably are easier than most fruit to look at in terms of being able to observe ripeness visually. And that then leads to a whole range of visualization potential for this as a mapping potential of the different shades of yellow. All of these are reasons why the banana is particularly appealing to me.
There is
May I say something?
Yeah.
I would like to say what I find really fascinating and also very useful about this ideas you have is that while different parts have been vocalized at different times in many places, you bring all of this together in a very comprehensible project. I also think this pilot study, which Joel was talking about, is an excellent idea, and especially if you do it simultaneously in more than one place.
Yeah.
So that you have, you know, a really interesting input. And I think that also, I think that the banana is, for all those reasons you listed, and some of you didn't even list yet, is a really great thing, because I think it is so much more, I don't even know what's the right word, but emphasizes the process than raspberries or something, even apples, because of the connotations. So I really look forward to it, and if we can help any ways, just let us know.
Well, I'm glad that you find it comprehensible. I don't think I've ever been accused of being comprehensible before. Or
I am unusual.
but yes, I really like this idea, Joel, of doing this in many places at once, and kind of, I think that a lot can be publicized around that. We have a finger raised. So Roger is bidding on a lot of bananas. Yes.
Okay, so Vanya, you did push the record button, did you?
Yes.
So I think it'll be interesting to see how we use this recording. I have 10 points I'd like to make. A few of them, maybe the diagonal one is one of my close friends here in Dallas is a Republican. And I meet with him for tea every other week, but he's a sitting Texas judge. And he now officiates in Zoom trials. And one of his articles, and I'm happy to share it with you, is on techno evidence. Judges are now making decisions based on techno evidence. You're not in the same room as the witness. Zoom is providing evidence that the person replied to your question. The other part of techno evidence is so much evidence in the trial is presented by a machine, but you cannot cross-examine a machine. So if an ATM gave you a receipt for $500, but you got no money, how does the human being prove the machine is a thief? Well, you cannot cross-examine the machine. And so his major point is, and this connects to your very big picture, that the legal system was designed period where the witnesses were humans, and you develop techniques for cross-examining a person to find out if they were lying or misremembering or whatever. and so I think by analogy, your argument about election, our election system is based on, so should children have a right to vote? Should bananas have a right to vote? Don't we want an election to protect our ecosystem? Well, then let's give the bananas a vote. I'm going rotten too quickly here. Please, I'll vote against you. So I'll send you this article on techno evidence, but it's a parallel argument that the legal system is still thinking in terms that are no longer applicable. Another part of his argument is a lot of the techno evidence, well, every 10 years, the engineers figure out a better way to measure something, and the evidence 10 years ago is now wrong, like DNA evidence. So people have been put in jail based on DNA evidence. 20 years later, the better technology for analyzing DNA shows that person was not in that room when the person was killed. So now he's had to free people from jail based on machines lying. And you can't even cross-examine the machine. So I think the analogy is with your comment about the electoral system, that it's only adults who can vote, only legal immigrants who can vote, the plants can't vote, the birds can't vote. How do you design an electoral system so how everybody around us, including the animals and the plants, are doing well? And, it is provocative to give the vote to kids and plants. But I think the reasoning is correct. Okay, so my second thing is a practical thing. Vanya Negrete, in a moment of weakness, started working on passports for plants.
Right.
And she discovered the EU already issues passports to plants. You cannot spread plants around Europe without giving them a passport. GMO plants can't get passports in Europe. They can in America. So, you know, the idea of very simple things of giving passports to bananas, what risk do they pose to America if the banana crosses the border? Well, they get rotten and they create a lot of, what was the gas?
Ethylene.
Not phosphine, it was
Ethylene.
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 So how do you know, plants are not native to North America. Bananas are not, bananas are not native to North America. So maybe before we let in bananas, we should give them a passport just like migrants from Mexico. Now, Vanya kind of proposed that as an ironic criticism, but it might be very easy to implement, to just start issuing passports to plants. Okay, I have 6 more, but let me just finish this one. This morning, I listened to a presentation by one of our PhD students who's a legal migrant from Asia. And she arrived in America during the pandemic and during the racist and xenophobia. Now, she does not dare turn on the television because she's dangerous. She's a legal migrant. And for some reason, once in the evening, as the sun is setting, all these flocking birds appear and are sitting on the telephone wires, chirping away, dancing around. They're clearly happy, if dancing around with other birds is a sign of happiness. And she asked the question, are the plants below them happy? Well, they're dropping all this bird shit from the flock of birds is just shitting on the ground. She's a migrant from Asia. Somehow this metaphor of migrating birds had captured her attention. Why is that migrating birds in Dallas are happy, but migrating people in Dallas are unhappy? So how do you get the plants to vote and not just the people? So you know, let me tell you, I think there are many ways that we could contribute in small ways to your mega provocation of giving the vote to kids and plants and animals, and maybe viruses should be able to vote. I'll stop there, but I have 6 other points.
So yes, I have been looking at bacteria and archaea in terms of enfranchising them. Viruses, I think, are fascinating because of the fact that there's such a debate over whether they in fact are alive. They clearly have, in terms of numbers, a majority.
Let me interrupt you. COVID-19 is not racist. We should elect the viruses. They're not racist. COVID-19 is not a racist virus. Some viruses do affect people of different races differently, but not COVID-19. So let's elect the viruses and we would have a less racist society.
It may be true also for bacteria. Some bacteria, that could be the case as well. But I do think that we need to, in terms of viruses, recognize that not only are they detrimental, but also that they have been enormously beneficial, depending on how we want to look at beneficial and detrimental, which are problematic terms. and we need to problematize those terms. That is to say that evolutionarily speaking, through horizontal gene transfer, it's hard to imagine how we would have gotten to the complexity that we have on this planet in terms of life forms were it not for viruses facilitating some aspects of genetic remixing. But yeah, I think this is really interesting. I would love to think more and to talk more about techno evidence, and to think more and talk more about how it is that, for instance, the signal that we use in terms of determining collective will is one where we ask people to go to the polls every 2 years and to decide in a very confined and constrained set of circumstances what their preferences are. That's a technology. And just as DNA evidence that was believed to be accurate 10 years ago now actually proves to be the opposite. I think that likewise we can find as we try out different ways in which we are polling people, for instance, adults, for instance, even, that we may find that likewise that polling process is actually leading to an inaccurate signification of what people actually want. So that to me is really interesting to think about, especially when we explode the idea of technology in ways that I think we really need to do. I also really like the birds and the plants as a subject because of the fact that I think that plants are sessile, animals, including birds, are in many cases migratory, which is to say that they have, when we start thinking about precincts, I think that it ends up leading us to some really interesting questions. And this leads us to interesting questions about belonging, borders, boundaries, ways in which ecosystems have certain boundaries that are nested in certain ways, but also that are fluid in other ways. And so ultimately, can the process of trying to come up with some sort of an electoral system lead us to alternate ways of thinking about statehood? So to me, and also to thinking about different ways in which we construe belonging and different ways in which we construe otherness. So all of this is definitely very central, I think, to the sorts of provocation that I'm interested in. And I'm excited to pursue those lines of conversation. And of course, Vanya's passports, which she shared with me, I love them. They're amazing. And I do think that the idea of bananas as migratory workers moving across borders in order to be able to do the poll work and having passports to do so definitely adds another level of provocation to all that we're talking about here. So
are yellow bananas better than green bananas, Vanya?
I don't know. Maybe I think maybe yellow bananas are better because you can eat them already, and yeah, green ones aren't ripe yet. So maybe
This
it's
is
like
your implicit racism. You favor yellow bananas over green bananas or red
maybe
bananas.
it's ageism.
Oh, they're just babies. I can eat them.
We have 3 minutes left. When the session closes, remember to click on the same link I sent you so we can proceed with the call, like with the meeting.
So
once we do that, so what is one thing that this group could do to help you once a week? And, for some reason, we've been meeting once a week now for months.
mm-hmm.
How could we seed your project by doing, we don't have any funding, we're all volunteering.
Right.
What could we do on a regular basis that would feed into the success of your project?
I really like what Joel brought up at the very beginning of how do we create a network. And I think that one of the great advantages of this group is that we're all in different places. So Joel and I are not that far from each other geographically, but nevertheless, there is a pretty broad range to begin with. And also there's a huge range in terms of the people we know. collectively. So I think that setting up that initial group of pollsters, of banana differential pollsters, and beginning a process of data collection and of determining what the collective will is at various levels would be really interesting. I do want to ultimately look at ways in which to build technologies on top of this, such as, for instance, using a smartphone camera and color monitoring software to be able to automate. But I don't think that's the place to start. First of all, we don't have the data to do so. And secondly, it leads already to a level of abstraction where I think what is appealing to me about this is that it's entirely possible that eating the bananas will be the best way to go about this. And there's just something that about that visceral experience of finding out the state of the planet by eating bananas that really appeals to me. So I think that if we can start to formulate a way in which to implement this in the worlds that we know, and to think about what the variations are that we would like to have running simultaneously in parallel, that would be really appealing. And then I would, because you're kind of the ultimate brain trust, to collectively look at what we start to see and how we can, not only how we can learn from it in terms of refining the system, but how we can better activate this system in order to be able to continually generate new ways of thinking and new areas that we're thinking about. So in other words, not to let it simply become a matter of, though it wouldn't be just even in this case so simple, but not just to simply make it into a matter of finding out what the plants want, democratically speaking, but all these other questions about techno evidence, for instance, and all the other ways in which we are, each one of us, through our other conversations, coming into different areas that are under thought, that people are not thinking about outside of the routine ways that we.
Okay, but there's Joel. Do you have a short written version of what you just presented to us as your
Yes,
initiative? If you could share that with us again, is it okay for us to share it with other people?
Yeah, absolutely. That would be great.
Okay, what I will do is I'll share it with the judge. I'll ask him to share his paper with us. It just got accepted for publication. I forget which journal, but he's the kind of person that I think could bring some interesting insights from his perspective in the legal profession.
Great.
Sitting judge and lawyer. The reason I know him, for what it's worth, is he worked on the early Apollo program and wrote an early history of Apollo space program. And he and I are both members of the International Academy of Astronautics, and there's an Institute of Space Law that he's a member of. So if you ever want to know how this question might apply outside the Earth, he's the person to ask. And
yeah, that's
I don't
great.
think anybody has ever launched a banana into space yet.
Yes, but monkeys were some of the first to go, so there's already a demand.
Yes.
So yeah, that would be really, I think that'd be great.
Anyway,
I think
share
it would
with
also
us
be
your
great.
write-up, and then
Okay.
we'll all do some more thinking.
And I think that thinking about how this manifests publicly in the places that we have contact would be really interesting to consider. That is to say, might the banana differential be something that there's a public space, such as in City Hall, in various cities, that this is undertaken so that it has more of a civic and public front end to it, where then the back end is that everybody is doing it, but that there's a sort of a formal way in which this is presented to and in the world could be a way in which to generate the interest and gain the momentum on moving this forward. So if
Okay,
you
well,
might
the
think
next
about
time I
that.
vote in Dallas, I'd be happy to have my picture taken, bringing a bunch of bananas to vote with me.
Well, that's a great start.
Seems to me, Jonathan, that one of the things that we could do in response to your request is to help identify those 3 to 5 potential collaborators
Mhm.
or individuals that might be willing to be the involved in the sort of pilot study, and from there, bringing that group of people together, we could determine what makes sense in terms of the sort of public interface for the enterprise. But it seems like the next step is really getting it to happen.
Yeah.
And setting up like I said earlier, a sort of pilot study to see how it works. And I think maybe that's something that we could all think about in terms of who we might be able to connect with you to explore that a bit further. The other thought that I was having about all this was that I think it's important. I mean, in thinking about decision reckoning and decision processes in general, and we just went through and we are still going through this crazy political shenanigans that we're experiencing, here in the U.S. With the Republican Party. And clearly, in many ways, the Republican Party doesn't represent Republicans. It represents something else. And when we start talking about, the stakeholders as being individuals or communities, the differential changes a bit. And it just seems like that's an important distinction to be had in terms of the decision, the impact of decision processes. Or is this about is this about the policy making that can emerge from the individual entity, or is it about or the voting that emerges from the individual entity that influences the overall, or is it about the shaping of communities of thought? And I don't quite know the answer to that. Last point I would make is that there's a company, and I think I can connect you to them. There's a company in Santa Barbara. It's called Appeal. And what they have been doing is figuring out a method to prolong the shelf life of avocados by controlling the ethylene decomposition release of the avocados. And they have worked with bananas and other fruit as well. And this is a huge big deal, of course, because there's, in places where refrigeration is complicated, or, there's long periods of shipping involved, being able to coat the fruit, if you will, with a substance that's going to intervene in that process becomes really important, and sounds a lot like the Republican Party.
That's so yes, I would love to connect with them. And Nina, yes, I see you. So but just very briefly, I would love to, because one of the big problems I think is to do with feedback mechanisms, and whether in fact the banana ultimately overwhelms the system in terms of its own self-ripening process. So how do we control for the banana ultimately voting and having a greater voice in the plant that we're actually trying to pull? So yeah, that would be great. But Nina, what were you? You're mute. You're muted.
Okay, I would like to ask you, are you interested or totally against something like a manifesto which can be spread around and promoted across all our networks? I don't know whether a banana manifesto is the right word, but something like that.
Mhm.
I've been involved in this type of things in different subjects, and they were very surprisingly very effective. It reached a lot of people, and there was a lot of feedback from unexpected areas. But of course, this is something you have to.
I love the manifesto as an art form.
Yeah, as
In
an
its
art.
own right. So, and also I've been talking with Earth Law Center about writing for their newsletter, which gets this into the hands of a lot of NGOs in the rights of nature realm. So it could be that that would be another place in which to publish it. But yes, I think it's a great idea. And
today, you know, Jonathan, there are all sorts of new forums because of our Zoom
Right.
life. And so it would go very far.
Yeah, I think that that's a great idea. I will work on that. Yes.
Okay, I have an offer. So I'm working on some fundraising proposals where I could maybe include a little bit of money for this, the idea you have. But let me elaborate. And Joel and Vanya and Nina know a little bit about it. But I'm working with a group at the University of Houston and Johns Hopkins University. And it's neuroscientists, and we're creating a working group for neurohumanities, which will include Judge Marshall for the neuro law. And the neuroscientists are very excited because there are now new emerging sensors called mobile brain imaging sensors that you can wear on your head all day as you're doing other things, and it can monitor, react to your brain activity. So if you're epileptic seizures, there's a professor at Stanford who has a startup company. You wear this thing, and if about a minute or 2 minutes before you have an epileptic seizure, it warns you, stop driving, sit down, you're about to have a seizure, you don't want to have an accident. So it can, you know, and obviously the person's conscious self isn't aware that the brain is rumbling and saying I'm about to have a seizure. But one thing I like about it is they also have a tattoo version of these mobile brain imaging sensors. And it's a bandage that looks like a tattoo. And the idea in this big proposal is to get these into the hands of everyday people. And not just people with epileptic seizures. And obviously one of the interests is understanding how artists' brains synchronize their activities, right? So we all know how in group arts activities, if you do enough dress rehearsals, your brain is now different. And you know, each jazz musician knows when it's their turn to play. There's no script, there's no instructions, nobody says it's your turn, but the brains listen to what's going on and they, oh, it's my turn now. But maybe we could even use these sensors to know how people might vote.
That's interesting.
Anyway, so as part of neurohumanities, I don't think you can use them on plants, but I'll find out if you can attach one to a banana. I'm sure the answer is no. But part of the neurohumanities working group that we're setting in place is a neuroethics. So it's bad enough that Zoom is listening to all our Zoom calls and they know exactly what we're saying. Do we want Zoom to know what we're thinking? So, you know, maybe the next version of Zoom will require you to wear one of these mobile brain imaging caps. And then Zoom not only knows what you're saying, but what you're thinking. And so part of the neurohumanities is, hold on a second, do we really want this project to succeed? Right. But what I like is the idea of, it's one thing to know if a person is well, but how do you know if the plants in your living room are well? And Eduardo Kac did these wonderful projects with sensors on plants. And he even got this project in the Olympics where the birds were talking back to the signals from the plants.
Mhm.
You know, the data collected from the plant was sonified, the bird heard it and would learn to respond, and then inject a signal into the plant. So that, you know, this idea that who's feeling well in my room right now? Well, I'm feeling well. I'm rattling on, and I'm excited by your ideas, but that plant over there hasn't budded in 6 months. I think I overwatered it. Maybe I could have a sensor on it telling me that it's thirsty. No, it's overwatered right now. It's drowning in water. So
this is great.
I can imagine just a micro way of including your idea in this. Our proposal has to be submitted in May. It's a proposal for an engineering research center, $5 to $10 million. But just putting as a provocation a little bit of funding in this proposal, and I don't know if I can convince all the co-investigators, but convincing them to be part of what the manifesto would be doing. That do we just monitor brain signals, and why don't we monitor plant signals?
I think that even the more simple, so I think that I love that, but I think that even if we were to think about it in terms of how this apparatus might vote for people and for animals. So I think that it's a much more direct way in which to think about this. So neuroethics, definitely, this is a subject that I've been thinking about a lot, and my work with EPFL in Switzerland has been brain-computer interfaces in terms of how that might affect the future of work. I also, right now, I have a residency with a memory and aging center at UC San Francisco, again, looking at, in this case, looking at fMRI and ways in which that might lead to alternate ways in which to understand how symbolism works, and therefore alternate ways in which to think about how we might create civic statuary to create some sort of means by which people can understand each other fundamentally. So in any case, all of this is very much within the realm that I'm thinking about now, and I have a lot that I could bring into it, but I really like the specificity of using this sort of brain monitoring apparatus and thinking about what sort of voting apparatus that might be for humans and for animals. And then if we want to take Mancuso's work seriously in terms of the neurology of plants, then yes, too, we can look at plants in terms of how the same sensor might be applied to plants. And that also becomes a way in which to ask fundamental questions about the nature of intelligence, the nature of how we think and how we process information. So would love to discuss that with you further and figure out what would be the most likely way to get what probably are relatively sober-minded researchers interested in something that is somewhat outrageous. And I agree that regardless of what happens, the act of trying to do it is part of the work in its own right.
Yeah, just to finish, I mean, part of the idea of this neurohumanities working group is to really be a little bit provocative to the neuroscientists who are so technophilic that it's frightening.
I know.
They just want more gadgets to measure more brain signals. And, and so, the idea behind the neurohumanities is just not the ethics, but also we can make that, the cat can keep monitoring what the brain activity is, and then when you wake up, your brain created an artwork. And it's not a dream because it's different signals, right? You get into interesting things about how a dream activates parts of the brain. Anyway, so we haven't made any dream works yet. I guess that trademark exists already.
But yeah, I think questions of authorship and responsibility.
Nina, Can we bring in the indigenous perspective on this?
Yes, but we have to be very carefully concentrate on what and how to do it. Because, for example, at this Leo board meeting, there was talk about indigenous, input and so forth. And now there is something, posted all over the place without consultation. So we, yes, but we have to consult and be respectful.
And the difficulty is we consult other people by reading their books. In indigenous cultures, book writing is not part of the culture.
Indigenous communities consult.
So, Roger, can you possibly send more information about this initiative my way?
Yeah, the project manager is Kristen Dupree.
Mhm.
Just to give you a little bit of DUEPREE, Kristen. She's a major in brain and behavioral science.
Mhm.
Now working in my research lab, our research lab. She's leading the development of this proposal, so I'll put you in touch with her and have her share there's a short version of the proposal we're working on. But the other part of it is she's now setting up a private studio in the countryside of Texas, where she's going to teach music informed by contemporary brain science. So we still teach music like we did 200 years ago. Where's the maestro? And we have a very different understanding now of how the brain uses sound to figure out what's going on and how you can train the brain to listen, but also to make sounds, how we vocalize things. So in her case, she's very interested. Also, she's been trying to do podcasts with the plants and animals where she lives, but we failed so far. She set up a way where the birds would be twerping, and then she'd say something to the birds and then wait for the birds to reply. And they never got into, with some, is it parakeets? I think there are some birds you can actually get into a back and forth with the bird. It's like a conversation between a human and a bird, but certainly the birds in her garden, just don't want to talk back. So, she's coming at these issues with, a degree in brain and behavioral science, a passion for making sound and music, and she's coordinating this proposal to see how we go forward. So I'll do those two things. I do still think we want to come back to this. Is there a really simple thing that we could do with you? The manifesto is one idea and us spreading it, right? We be inseminators, or whatever you call it, when people spread things. But what is a little thing that we could do that engages with your project?
I was, I don't know, this is kind of a suggestion in some way. There was, when Nina brought up the idea of a manifesto, I started thinking about a Dutch artist group, Superflex. I don't know if you're familiar with them, but it's a consortium, and they did a project years ago called Free Beer.
All right.
Don't do the recipe. Something that was intended to get you excited, a little more excited than normal. And then they made the license recipe for this available through Creative Commons. and for anybody to produce free beer. And then the only stipulation is that if you did it, if you used the license, you had to publish the outcomes of it. And it created this really interesting dissemination process and networking and community building process around this whole conception of free beer as a kind of conceptual art action. And it was literally all over the world. I mean, and I think I have a free beer here somewhere in the studio that I saved. So, and I was thinking about this, how to simplify, but also create a process for individuals to engage in the banana differential and find manifestations of its public interface in their own communities, publish those, and share those.
Yeah.
So it becomes less of a sort of top-end management strategy on your part to sort of coordinate, a whole bunch of different nodes and an enterprise, as opposed to sort of putting it into the world in a way that it takes on its own life.
I really like that. I mean, this is, I think, already the idea with the protocol that I'll send all of you that is meant to be open in terms of others contributing to it. But yeah, I want to have another look at. I wrote about free beer years ago, and I hadn't thought about it since then. But it is really interesting when you frame it in those terms. I like it anyway as a project, but when you frame it in those terms of the community that's created, that's really interesting.
It's just something to take a look at. And so, I think our objective, I'm just trying to be respectful of our time, and I think Roger's questions is completely apropos. What small things can we do in order to nudge this all forward to help you? And I think step one is for you to share with us a kind of concise statement about the enterprise, and then we should look to see if there are some natural connect points in our networks of potential collaborators who would help move this forward. And maybe you can give some thought to this idea of a distributed license kind of framework. I'm just looking for the hooks, that we could be the practical, just being practical about how to nudge this thing forward.
Because, obviously, in this kind of project, some of it is conceptual and some of it is practical. One of the things I noted down was 25 years ago, when I was a techno-optimist, the cell phone apps came out that allowed you to measure your carbon footprint. And I've never loaded them onto my new cell phones. So, I'm someone that used to travel a lot, eat a lot, drink a lot, and it would calculate your carbon footprint every day. And, on the one hand, it made me self-aware of what the dominant pieces of my carbon footprint were, like going to scientific conferences across the world. 3,000 people just flew to Ars Electronica in Austria. Well, maybe that's not a good idea. The carbon footprint is shameful. Let's practice what we preach. But the other part of it was somehow I did not integrate it into my daily life. And so it's one thing to do a demo and point something out to people, but how could the 5 of us start voting on things using your protocol?
Yeah.
What are we going to discuss next week? How do we give the plants in our rooms a voice?
Yeah.
I'm going to the grocery store and buying bananas today.
Now I need to look up on how you keep them from going brown too quickly like avocados.
Well, it's all about appeal.
This meeting has been successful already. I will no longer have dead avocados I have to throw away and dead bananas.
Exactly.
I don't think I dare eat this one.
Wow, that's quite something.
It would
Oh,
be
well.
important. It remains important that we go back always to the basics and then go out again to the bigger picture, and that and these basics are now so much more relevant in our daily locked up life than they were before, because you really have to examine them all the time. But I think all your ideas could be expanded to the basics of other people's daily life, and that would be really.
Yeah, I would really like that. I mean, I think that the practice of observing your environment and means by which to sensitize you, meaning everybody, to that, that really is kind of central to this project as well as so many of my other projects. So the creation of time standards that are based on the growth of trees or flowering of plants or the flow of rivers are very much involved in that as well. So okay, so I think that this is a really practical question that you've asked me, which is what might you be able to do? What might we be able to do together that would be simple but would advance this project? Let me give that some thought over the weekend and come back to you with some thoughts about that. I think that already I feel like that space is being defined in some interesting ways that are exciting to me, but let me give it a bit more thought. And if any of you think of anything as well, I'll share with you the protocol now or in an hour or two. And if any of you think of anything in the interim, then let's just keep up that exchange. Does that sound good?
Very good.
That's great.
Just quickly, do any of you know Steve Pope?
Who, Steve?
Pope.
Mm-mm.
Okay, well, I'm having dinner with him. He's one of the pioneers in the computer music area. And he's in Dallas for 2 weeks testifying at a trial. I don't know why I have so many friends in the legal, but he's testifying in a lawsuit about a patent involving the music industry. Anyway, in case anybody knew him, I thought I'd mention it.
Well, thank you, everyone.
Thank
Really
you.
grateful for your interest in these shenanigans and hoping that we can bring them out in the world and really engage people. I mean, I love this whole context of provocation, and your ideas are really helping me to think through how to make this something bigger. So I'm grateful for that already.
It's awesome, John.
Nina, once you hang up, can I call you?
Yes, but
No, Nina.
Yes,
Oh.
but I have to go to another meeting, so if you could do it immediately, that would
Yeah,
be
I'll do it immediately. I just have a quick thing to run by you.
I'm here.
great. So I will, I guess, let all of you continue your meeting without me. Would that be helpful? Would that be good?
It's getting finished, no?
I think we're done.
Yes.
Yeah.
I think we're done for today.
Done.
And
Thank you, Vanya.
I'll circle back to everybody about next week. Okay, thank you.
Well, thank you again. Really enjoyed it. Really appreciate your including
Bye.
me.
Bye.
And
Bye.
I'll be back in touch with you soon. Okay, bye.
Yes, Jonathon.